program is made possible by public television stations and by a grant from Sperry Corporation, computer-based information systems for business, industry, government, and national defense.
People are not the only ones who travel around the world and settle down in new places. Plants and animals do too, and air travel has increased this non-human globe-trotting almost exponentially. Hi, I'm George Page for Nature. You can bring almost any plant or animal species to a tropical or subtropical setting like this, and it will thrive. And that's exactly what's happening in Florida, where they made many of the old Tarzan movies. The Hollywood producers brought in monkeys from India that are now living wild at Silver Springs, as we'll see in Jet Set Wildlife. Jackrabbits, brought to Florida from the open plains of the Midwest about 10 years ago to work with greyhounds. Their job, to teach the greyhounds to chase electric hares. But one day, some of them escaped. And, as rabbits will do, they proliferated. The open plain they live on now is Miami International Airport. These jet-set jackrabbits have prospered. They're hundreds of miles from their original home, but who wouldn't flourish in sunny Florida? Not many of Miami's millions of visitors will even notice the jackrabbits. From all over the world, 20 million people a year fly in to this land of oranges and opportunity for business, to make a new home, but mostly for vacations. It's the sunshine capital of the world for people, but few of us realize it's the same for wildlife. The subtropical climate that makes Florida ideal for human holidays also means that just about any foreign animal or plant that can hitch a lift here will survive and probably make a permanent home. They're coming in from every corner of the globe. This is Grinnell's Park in the center of Miami. Every year in this protected area, white ibis come to nest. These elegant wading birds are native to Florida. But in 1959, Carter Bundy, a local ornithologist, thought it would be an interesting experiment to introduce into the colony some eggs of the scarlet ibis, which he brought in from Trinidad. They hatched. 8 of the original birds survived and interbred with the whites. And here, some 20 years later, is the result: pink ibis. Today, they're rather pale and washed-out shadows of their scarlet ancestors because they've continued to interbreed with the native whites. Was this exercise in practical ornithology, as it's been called, a sensible thing to do? In fact, does it matter at all? It's certainly not countenanced by present-day ornithologists, but it seems to have had little impact on the birds themselves. And if you're not being too scientifically starchy about it, it was fun for Carter Bundy. But some of Florida's animal immigrants were brought in for more practical reasons. When the early American colonists first set out to claim the New World, they brought with them domestic animals from the old country, including pigs. Over the years, many of them ran wild, and in as little as 4 generations, they started to show the characteristics of wild pigs. The quiet pink porker reverted to a lean black boar. The sow, ready to breed at 4 months old, can produce up to 50 young in her first 5 years. Multicolored litters attest to their assorted domestic ancestors, but these conspicuous and colorful piglets tend to be weeded out by local predators, the bobcat and the alligator. The typical Pharaoh hog is black or dark brown, with a large snout and bristling hackles along its back. Many males also have ferocious tusks. Hogs are very good sport to hunt and very tasty to eat. But are they really a good animal to have around here, and in such vast numbers? Florida has set up 125 state parks to protect native animals, like the white-tailed deer. Should they have to share the parks with wild pigs? Hogs, it said, will eat everything, except the earth. But they do plow it to find their food: roots, plants, animals, including snakes, carrion, even other dead hogs. It would take 50 years for the landscape here to recover and the plants to grow again. A hog foraging is like a bulldozer gone berserk. Should this destructive immigrant be accepted as part of Florida's early Spanish settler tradition or not? It's a question Floridians themselves will have to answer. Farm animals are still brought into Florida in large numbers, but it's in places like this that the jet-set Noah's Ark unloads today, a wholesale warehouse for the pet trade. Pets are big business in Florida. For example, 1 million cockatiels were imported into the United States last year, another million homebred. And parakeets. 2 million were sold last year. The parakeet is often the first bird someone buys before moving on to something more costly. Reptiles and amphibians, almost anything you want, can be found in pet shops. This company is not only successful, it's well and conscientiously run. It now breeds some of its own stock. 2 of this type, the hyacinth macaw, 60 macaws in total, were bred last year to save taking them from the wild. In the past, the pet trade has been held responsible for the escapes of many foreign animals. That's rarely true today. But when the pet leaves the shop in the hands of its new owner, what then? When it becomes inconvenient to take care of, many pet owners think it's kind just to set it free in the Florida sunshine. Glenn Freed, who runs a neighborhood wildlife center just south of Miami, gets called out to deal with any strange animal that happens to turn up.
This is a Burmese python. This particular one is about 10 feet long, weighs about 45 to 50 pounds. And this is one that a lady had called us on. She was quite alarmed when she was watching TV one evening and looked out her window and saw this thing looking back in at her. She got a few of the neighbors around and they didn't know what to do, and finally someone got in touch with us and we ran over and got him. He turned out to be quite nice. Someone originally had him as a pet, although it seemed like he'd been out in the wild for at least several weeks before we got him. Quite common to find these around here now, since a lot of people, once they get this size, it's too big for their apartment or their house, or they can't keep up with feeding them, since they like to eat about 1 large chicken a week or several rats at this size. And between the caging room and the food, they just can't keep up with them, and they feel like they're doing the snake a favor by releasing them into the wild. If the people would leave them alone, they would be able to breed, but most people don't. They've either caught them and kept them as pets after they've been released, or they've killed them when they see them.
The real purpose of Glenn's Nature Center is to teach people about native animals. He looks after them, too.
The gray foxes are our only native fox down here in South Florida. They've adapted quite well to the urban life in recent years, learning to live around houses, eating cat and dog food that people have left out, a lot of fruits and small rodents, but they seem to be doing fairly well. The raccoon is a fairly common animal. They do wander into neighborhoods quite frequently. Most of them have been abandoned as babies when they've crawled up into people's attic and made their nest, and the people have blocked out the parents, and we have to go retrieve the babies and raise them.
But it's usually something weird that's worrying people. You're unpacking your suitcase after a trip to Honduras, and this hairy hitchhiker crawls out. In Florida's climate, it could easily survive. A friendly toucan, on the other hand, is a welcome visitor. Likewise, peacocks, which have bred wild in Florida for centuries.
These particular peacocks were running through a neighborhood where no one knew where they had come from. They had been chased by dogs and had most of their feathers pulled out. Several of them have been released recently that people had for pets, and several of them are also left over from the days when this area was first settled and the settlers brought them in for their looks and for food. We get quite a few calls on ferrets. In the last 5 years, it's become a very popular pet here, and they're extremely good escape artists. The coatimundis are native to Central and South America. They do enter into the United States in the Southwest just a small bit. Their range doesn't come anywhere near Florida, and these have obviously been someone's pet that either had escaped or been released. This is a pair, and I'm sure if they were left out there, they're very similar to the raccoons, and they'd be able to survive probably just as well and breed. And if they were a more popular pet, it would be another one of the animals that would probably establish itself here.
Which might be rather nice. Apart from obviously dangerous species, wouldn't Floridians welcome new animals around their homes? This question of animal immigrants is of great concern to Professor Walter Courtney of Florida Atlantic University.
My immediate reaction to hearing about a new exotic being found in the state of Florida is, oh no, not another one. I'm always interested in finding out what it is, where it is, and then looking at the potential for what it might do to our native natural resources. If it's confined, however, my immediate attitude is wipe it out. Don't take the chance.
No one would want to take a chance with the spectacled caiman from South America. It's now breeding freely in the network of drainage canals that covers southeast Florida. The caiman is a relative of the alligator and the crocodile, but much more aggressive than either, a really dangerous animal. And caimans have been known to grow up to 9 feet long. Some 200 caimans were removed from this area last year in a campaign to wipe them out. The campaign continues. Also brought from South America in the hope that it would control insect pests is the giant toad, a 9-inch monster. It's a carnivore, preying on native lizards and frogs, but also a hazard to pets. To a dog, for example, which may find the toad helping itself to its dish of dog chow. The poison in the glands behind its eyes has been compared to cobra venom and can cause paralysis or even death. Florida today is a growing menagerie of misplaced reptiles and amphibians. This impressive-looking newcomer is the spiny-tailed iguana from Central America. So far, it's restricted to an area south of Miami. The Cuban tree frog, on the other hand, has already spread over most of South Florida, driving out the native tree frog as it goes. Cuban tree frogs will eat virtually anything, including each other. And this is one of the animals being swept aside by the invasion, the native green anole. Florida chameleon, it's called, because it changes color as it warms up. As well as being a potential dinner, it also suffers because it has to compete for territory and for food with more powerful foreign rivals, like the much bigger night anole from Cuba, another lizard which lives in trees. And still they come. The giant Jamaican anole is much larger again. At present, it lives in restricted colonies. But the outlook for native reptiles and amphibians is poor. Over 20 foreign species are now well established in Florida. Like these brown anoles from Cuba, they're much more aggressive than the natives, and they have no predators. They were left behind in their tropical homelands. In just a few years, the invaders have triumphed. The James Bond novels told us about piranhas stripping the flesh from a body in a matter of minutes. Their importation into the state is now forbidden by law. So today, these, in a research laboratory tank, are the only live piranhas left in Florida, we hope.
As far as fishes and other wildlife concerned, the state does require by law that one obtain a permit prior to any introduction. Of course, the record shows that people have not been applying for permits and just introduce whatever they want.
With this in mind, a program of intensive sampling is being carried out at selected sites on Florida's waterways. Blasting was chosen as the most humane method. The object of the sampling is to check out what sorts of fish are present and in what numbers. Scientists from the Non-Native Fish Research Laboratory, led by Paul Shafland, sort the fish into species. No man-eating piranha, thank goodness, but it soon becomes clear that the majority of the fish are foreigners. This is a Mozambique tilapia from Africa. The female broods the eggs in her mouth, a good protection against predators. The pike killifish. Medical researchers dumped them into a canal at the end of an experiment. It's a miniature predator with needle-sharp teeth. This war-mouthed sunfish is the only native species to appear in the sample. Indeed, at the end of the day's work, only 2 out of every 10 fish sampled was a native, a typical result. The foreigners may be aggressive, they may be better at caring for their young. Either way, they're more successful. It's sad for the native fish, and sad for the angler, too. The native fish are better to eat. But the most sinister success story is undoubtedly that of the Siamese walking catfish, introduced for the pet trade in the 1960s. It walks by pushing with its stiff pectoral fins and lashing its tail, and it soon walked out of captivity. Even more remarkable is its method of breathing. The catfish can take oxygen directly from the air, as well as dissolved in water. In cool, moist conditions, it's been known to survive out of water for as long as 85 days. A remarkable animal, but a most undesirable immigrant. It's a voracious and gluttonous feeder. It's even developed a resistance to the occasional cold winter, which might have restrained it. Efforts to control it have now been abandoned, and it's predicted that the Siamese walking catfish will soon dominate 3/4 of peninsular Florida. But it isn't all bad news living in the Sunshine State. For one thing, you can grow all manner of exotic fruit in your garden. The owners of this particular garden have not 1, but 13 different varieties of banana. They have fruits here we've hardly ever heard of. This is a Suriname cherry. Lychees, mangoes, guavas, and even old-fashioned mulberries. But this is the fruit that's almost synonymous with Florida. The groves occupy a huge band of countryside across the center of the state, and harvesting the orange crop each year, with the pickers moving from south to north, takes all of 4 months. From one viewpoint alone, you can see 17 million orange trees. But although the orange tree occupies a lot of land, it knows its place, and this isn't it. This is the Everglades National Park, an area of nearly 60,000 square miles comprising a number of special natural habitats unique to Florida. Mangroves, sawgrass hammocks, stands of dwarf cypress, and many more. But there's an intruder. The Brazilian pepper, or Florida holly as it's been nicknamed. It was introduced early this century as a garden shrub. It obligingly produces its crops of red berries at Christmas, at which time the migratory robin also obligingly turns up to complete the festive picture. In the course of the winter, thousands of robins pass through, eating the berries and thus sowing the seeds in wider and wider areas. The seedlings spring up as if by magic, carpeting any available patch of dry ground, even under a solid canopy of leaves. And now, there's an awful lot of Brazilian pepper. In fact, wall-to-wall Brazilian pepper, as far as the eye can see. Quite a solemn thought when you consider that this is the heart of the Everglades National Park, devoted to the conservation of native trees. This particular area is called the Hole in the Donut, an area in the center of the national park which was used for agriculture until the 1970s and is now being reclaimed for native plants. But the whole territory of the park is under siege from Brazilian peppers. The park's guardians are fighting back. This is one of the techniques being used by the park management staff. Spraying herbicide directly onto the trunk of each individual tree. Purple dye is incorporated with the spray to check the coverage. The technique is effective, but enormously costly in time and effort for the staff. So what about burning? Since Brazilian pepper is highly resistant to fire, they've had to call in another plant to help them, Pará grass, to serve as tinder for the flame. In a matter of minutes, the whole area is cleared by this fast burn, including the Pará grass, which regrows extremely rapidly. And that's just as well, because the tinder will be needed again. There's still a good deal of life left in that Brazilian pepper. The firing will have to be carried out at least 3 times before it's truly dead. Meanwhile, a vast climax forest of an alien plant, just where it's not supposed to be, with native plants driven out. How will it all end?
Well, at the rate we've been going since World War II, if at that rate of introduction, if that rate were kept up over the next series of decades, I would suspect that by the turn of this century, much of our vegetation and animals here in the state of Florida are going to be far more like Africa or South America than anything native to North America.
But maybe people like it that way. They're not too bothered if the wildlife they see is not native to North America or even to Florida.
Bumper, put it down. You know better. Put those rings down. You know the rules, one at a time. Don't do it. I don't know if that was cheater, just plain use it. Those are my 2 ring racers, Jasper and Bumper. My name is Tina, which is a Moluccan or salmon crested cockatoo, and she much prefers the sweet. Ladies and gentlemen, this does complete the Paris show. I do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Other people's interest in exotic birds is of a different kind. It's an extension of their interest and affection for birds in general. The bird feeding site is open to all comers. Surprisingly, the house sparrow is a foreigner in Florida. The handsome blue jay is one of the locals, but anyone with a bird feeder knows the delight of seeing new and colorful birds come into the garden. And the birds benefit too. These suburban bird feeders have played a crucial role in enabling released or escaped parrots to survive in an unfamiliar country. Also, the red-whiskered bulbul. A few of these escaped from a rare bird farm in 1969 and proceeded to multiply by 30 to 40% each year. In Miami, thanks to imported plants, they found many of the same plants to feed on, roost in, and make their nest of that they had known at home in India. Florida's own parrot, ironically called the Carolina parakeet, is now extinct. But with the immigrants, Miami seems set now to become the new parrot capital of the world. Today, all sorts of parrots are not only surviving here, but breeding. Monk parakeets took out naturalization papers long ago. They've been nesting in the Miami area at least since 1969. But back in its homeland of Argentina, the monk parakeet has been described as one of the worst pests of agricultural crops. How will Florida farmers react when flocks of parakeets head out into the countryside?
We have not seen that kind of damage occur yet, but I suspect within the next decade we will. And when that happens, I don't think the Florida Citrus Mutual, as it's known, will be very happy at all.
And it's not only Florida's farmers. Some of Florida's birds may have cause to complain about these newcomers. The red-bellied woodpecker is one of Florida's natives that nests in holes. The European starling arrived in the state about 10 years ago. It's a much more aggressive bird than the woodpecker and wouldn't hesitate to drive the native bird from the home it's spent hours making. The Indian myna, another aggressive bird and a potential home stealer, has also been seen recently in the Miami area. In fact, many of the introduced birds nest in holes. For the less aggressive native birds, this could soon cause a severe housing shortage. Even if Florida people are not too bothered about the homes of their native birds, they may well be concerned about their own. An apartment in a luxury condominium like this, on the coast north of Miami, could well cost $500,000, and something very nasty could be going to happen to it. The menace is very, very small, and Dr. Catherine Thompson has quite literally staked them out. This is one of 1,000 pine wood stakes she's placed in the ground to check out the Formosan termite. This stake was driven into the earth only 4 weeks ago, and already the soft parts of the wood are eaten away. No one knows how the termites arrived here in the early 1970s. They probably hitched a lift on a cargo boat. Back at home in Formosa, they're not so much of a problem. Most of the houses and furniture there are made of termite-resistant teak. Condos are made of concrete and steel, but they also have wood-block floors and wooden furniture. There can be 60,000 termites in one colony, and one night soon, these pre-alates, as they're called, will be ready to fly. And then, firms like this one are really going to be in business. Insects are also attracting attention at Archbald Research Station. Dr. Mark Dayrup has discovered that on the campus here, there are not only 91 native species of ant, but also 20 foreign ones. This species is from Mexico. As ants go, it's pretty large, but unlike many exotic ones, not very aggressive. Not only the number of species, but the vast number of individual ants is quite remarkable, as you'll see if you drop your picnic sandwich. But only one of the species here can be regarded as a problem.
The imported fire ant has the descriptive name of Solenopsis invicta, or the unconquered ant. And this thing comes from Brazil. This animal is very aggressive when it's under any sort of attack. Anytime you disturb the nest, the ants come pouring out. So all in all, it's an ant that is hated by everyone, though it must be said that it's a tasty ant if you happen to be an armadillo.
And here, far from its home in Brazil, the unconquered ant has met its match. Its old enemy, the South American nine-banded armadillo. Most of these foreign species become pests because they arrive without predators. But here, for once, the predator and prey are reunited. The armadillo, by the way, fell off the back of a circus truck and is now very common in Florida. The introduction of the armadillo hasn't really proved a problem, but for the vast majority of pest introductions, man has only himself to blame. He invited them in directly, like the Napier grass, planted to prevent erosion on railway lines, but also indirectly by creating the conditions in which they thrive. These tropical invaders are accustomed to fire and flood, storm and earthquake, and take instant advantage of the new empty habitats they provide. The plants on this rubbish heap, all introduced, take advantage of a man-made earthquake, and with construction, agriculture, and drainage, the surface of Florida is upheaved from end to end. In come instant species like lantana, a champion globetrotter. Pretty flowers, but all its parts are poisonous. Florida's waterways are a prime example. To turn the lush Everglades into a holiday haven, a vast network of drainage canals was built, 1,500 miles in southern Florida alone. The scene was set. And then, in 1974, a few of these fish were found in a canal near a group of fish farms, from which presumably they'd escaped. They're spotted tilapia, natives of West Africa. Spotted, but they don't acquire their spots until they reach maturity. Their increase has been dramatic. Only 4 years after they were first discovered in the wild, they'd become the dominant fish in many canals. More than half the fish present were spotted tilapia. Not only were native species displaced by their arrival, previously dominant foreigners like the Mozambique tilapia and black acara were driven out too by this extra aggressive invader. What's the secret of its success? One factor is the very special parental care given to the young. The spotted tilapia doesn't mouth brood like its relatives, but the spotted adult is tireless in guarding its little shoal of young. Added to this, the spotted tilapia has been seen to drive off from spawning beds and even kill rival species of the same size. Superfish, it seems, has arrived. The introduction of the Melaleuca might be described as a self-inflicted wound. It was deliberately introduced early this century by two men who were dissatisfied with Florida. Wet and mucky, they called it. The Australian Melaleuca was to dry up the swamps and provide timber. Quantities of seeds were scattered over the Everglades from low-flying aircraft. The landscape has certainly been transformed, but hardly as envisaged. Melaleuca today covers more than 500,000 acres in southern Florida. And now it's becoming very popular with landscape gardeners. Dr. Julia Morton has plotted its progress.
Now, the tree is bloomed heavily from November to January. Multitudes of bottle brush-shaped clusters of white flowers. When these trees are planted close to buildings, people begin to suffer respiratory trouble, also causing itching of eyes, swelling of face, and so forth. This has been a great concern of mine, receiving the complaints of people suffering, and not just individual, unusual people, but many, many people.
After many years of energetic campaigning by Dr. Morton, many communities have now banned the use of Melaleuca as an ornamental tree. Controlling the existing forests presents another problem. Fire, the obvious solution, is an ally of the Melaleuca. Its thick, papery bark insulates the mature tree from flames so that it's hardly touched by the fire. In fact, the heat actually encourages the seed pods to pop and shed seed. Like many Australian trees, the Melaleuca relies on fire to help it multiply. So, Melaleuca is a health hazard, a fire risk, a relentless rival of native trees, and has proved useless as timber. So what should be done about it?
I feel there's no solution whatsoever except working out the problem of total destruction. Total destruction of the tree, total elimination, and every month of delay means that there's more and more spread of this tree throughout South Florida.
As far as trees are concerned, I think it's going to be a race to the finish between the Brazilian pepper and the Melaleuca. And which one is going to win out, I wouldn't even begin to predict at this time. But I think what we're going to see by the turn of this century are tremendous climax forests of a single species, either the Melaleuca or the Brazilian pepper. Things of that nature really alarm me.
Foreign trees growing along the canals, foreign fish living in them, and the canals are even being blocked by a foreign water weed. Hydrilla is a weed commonly used to feed ornamental fish in aquariums. Some of it may have been simply thrown into canals when dumping tanks of unwanted fish. Some deliberately planted to harvest later. It succeeded only too well, and hydrilla is now blocking many miles of waterway. The South Florida Water Management Board employs a number of techniques to control it. Scooping up the weed mechanically, crowding it out with a less noxious weed, and this one, spraying. This underwater snowstorm is an emulsion of two herbicides, diquat and chelated copper, which settles directly onto the forest of hydrilla. Meanwhile, the non-native fish research laboratory is working on another way to control hydrilla. This will involve introducing a new sort of fish to eat it. A new introduced species? Yes, but the new fish will be an infertile hybrid, incapable of reproducing in the wild and causing unforeseen complications. Its parents will be the bullhead and the grass carp. The grass carp is well known as a voracious weed eater. Producing the hybrids is a complex business. Before release, the researchers must be absolutely certain that their performance can be relied upon. Until then, the latest batch of hybrids remain captive. So far, each fish seems to be eating half its weight in weed a day. But is this enough? Will they stick to hydrilla? And are they truly infertile? There must be no doubts before the hybrid carp is released to eat for its living. But there's yet another weed. Back in 1884, at an international cotton exposition, each guest was presented with a posy of this attractive flower, the water hyacinth. One lady took hers home and planted it in her garden pond, and it didn't stay there. Today, water hyacinth is found throughout Florida and the southeastern United States. The plants of water hyacinth float freely on the surface of the water. When one plant is broken off, the glossy leaves help it to sail away to a clear area where it will multiply with amazing speed. The hyacinth is able to float free because it absorbs its nourishment directly from the water itself by means of its hairy roots. The carpet of lush leaves becomes very dense, restricting the flow of water in canals by as much as 50%. And when they die, the decaying remains will remove all oxygen from the water, killing off the rest of the aquatic life. So this time, the South Florida Water Management Board takes to the air. Today, they're treating 750 square miles of Lake Okeechobee. The treatment is effective but expensive. Instead of destroying water hyacinth, wouldn't it be better to think of a way to make use of it? At this point, we call upon Florida's most famous introduced mammal.
Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse.
Walt Disney World has the responsibility of looking after the health and happiness of thousands of visitors throughout the year. Among other things, this also means dealing with the sewage. And that's where the water hyacinth comes in. At present, most of this sewage is processed by conventional means, but an experimental plant has also been set up. Chief Sanitary Engineer Ted McKim.
Currently, we're treating 5 million U.S. gallons of wastewater a day, somewhere around that neighborhood. That's equivalent to a population of 50 to 60,000 people in a typical city. The Hyacinth facility is entirely experimental, and what we're trying to demonstrate is an alternative technology, an alternate way to treat wastewater that we will not be utilizing as much energy in the process and still achieve the same degree of treatment.
The water hyacinth processes the sewage simply by doing what comes naturally. The plants feed by absorbing nitrates and phosphates out of the water through their roots. They also seem to be able to neutralize harmful viruses that may be present. Ultimately, the water is purified to a very high standard, as high as that demanded by Florida state law. Finally, the plant becomes saturated and can absorb no more. It can then be harvested and rotted down into compost for use on the stately gardens of Disney World. The decaying hyacinth can also be used to produce a very high grade of methane gas. It's estimated that 1 acre of harvested hyacinth could yield at least 1 million cubic feet of this valuable energy source. So far, the scheme is still at the experimental stage, but Disney World is investing in this, and the intention is very much to turn over the plant to hyacinth operation within the foreseeable future. This must be the oddest immigrant animal story of all. Back in the 1930s and 40s, when the Tarzan movies were being made, a troop of rhesus monkeys were brought here to Silver Springs in North Florida to play the walk-on parts. Somehow, they didn't all get rounded up, and the monkeys, or their descendants, are still bringing in the public. Tarzan, sadly, is no longer around. His ape call is triggered by an electric eye. But the monkeys are flourishing, the only group of free-living monkeys in North America. These rhesus monkeys are native to India, but living here suits them well. We notice the artificial trappings, but from a monkey's point of view, conditions in Florida are not unlike India. When the monkeys were first released, they were mostly adult females without young, so the population grew slowly. But now the balance is much more even. At the moment, there are 15 pregnant females in the colony and many babies and youngsters. The monkeys have been the subject of scientific study since the mid-1970s, currently by Dr. Linda Wolf. She knows the monkeys as individuals, not because she's marked them, but by natural features like damaged ears or the color of nipples. She also knows who is related to whom and what the exact order of precedence is in the monkey community. They, in turn, know her and scramble down to meet her. Normally, a scientist would avoid feeding the animals being studied, but at Silver Springs, being fed by humans is a regular part of the monkeys' lives. From her observation of the Southside monkeys, as Dr. Wolf calls them, the colony seems to be thriving.
From just the little bit of data that I have, I would say that the monkeys are doubling, that the troops are doubling in size about every 5 to 6 years. This troop, when it was originally studied, the study began in 1976, there was 22 monkeys, and now there's around 65 monkeys, so that the population growth is very rapid.
So rapid that there's been a population explosion. Rhesus monkeys swim well, even at an early age, so the river at the edge of Silver Springs Park presents no obstacle to them. Some years ago, individuals from the Southside colony swam across and founded a second colony on the north side. This is now prospering even more than the parent troop. The females give birth regularly, and numbers have built up to something like 200 animals, 3 times more than on the south. And they're starting to be a problem. They are a hazard on the highway. They overturn garbage cans and invade homes. More seriously, there are several reports of people being bitten. And rhesus monkeys, though not necessarily these individuals, are known to carry the viruses of TB, herpes, and hepatitis. Should some action be taken? Are there just too many monkeys?
I don't necessarily think that there'll be too many monkeys, not for me, but for local people, and to contain the monkeys within this area, there will be too many monkeys within about 5 years.
Too many monkeys. Too much Melaleuca. The problems of introduced animals are particularly acute in Florida, but they can arise anywhere. Our world is what we make it. Do we want it to be a great big melting pot of the toughest animals and plants that happen to drop in? Or should we be fighting to protect our own special wildlife?
One aspect that we have to look at when you're dealing with introductions of living organisms is that this is a form of biological pollution. And unlike thermal pollution or chemical pollution, you can't just simply turn off the tap. Once you release these things into the environment and they start reproducing and start increasing their ranges, they can move out very, very rapidly to displace native species. There's no question about that. It really amounts to introductions being a game of environmental roulette.
Next week, nature takes a close look at the remarkable skill that different birds display when building their nests. Our film is called The Master Builders, and it's next week on Nature.
Captain Ahab wasn't the only man after a white whale. The camera crew that shot our next program searched for one too, and they found it. Stay tuned to 11 and take part in the adventure. A Prospect of Whales is coming up next.